Hello and welcome to the Not a Day for Soundbites podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will Barber-Taylor. In this episode, I look at the speech that became the centrepiece of Hugh Hudson's famous party political broadcast, Kinnock the Movie, the speech that prompted Derek Hatton to shout liar, and the speech that decades later spawned several memes. I am, of course, talking about Neil Kinnock's 1985 Anti Militant Labour Party conference speech.
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Education, education, and education.
You start with far-fetched resolution. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real need.
We've changed the world before, and we're going to change the world again.
Neil Kinnock's political career began in South Wales. Kinnock, as he articulated throughout his career, was deeply immersed in the culture of Wales, and through that culture of his native country, the culture of the Labour Party. Kinnock's father worked in the coal mines of South Wales, and his mother was a district nurse. As Kinnock himself said, it wasn't that they weren't stridently political socialists. I learned very early on that the only source of strength we had was our diligence and the strength of numbers, of collective action. I was just under 15 when I was illegally, for the Labour Party rules then, allowed to join the Labour Party by our local ward secretary. And that's really where my politics, my democratic socialist politics, came from. Kinnock's local MP had been Nye Bevan, that towering figure of the Labour movement, who in Kinnock's own words showed how you could mix construction and inspiration. For Kinnock, Bevan was not just an inspiration because of his rhetoric, but because he got things done. Kinnock touched upon his background in one of his most well-known speeches in 1987.
Why am I the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Why is Glenys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Was it because all our predecessors were thick? Did they lack talent? Those people who could sing and play and recite and write poetry? Those people who could make wonderful, beautiful things with their hands? Those people who could dream dreams, see visions. But why didn't they get it? Was it because they were weak? Those people who could work 8 hours underground and then come up and play football? Weak? Those women who could survive 11 childbearings? Were they weak? Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent, or the strength, or the endurance, or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
It is this combination of fiery prose and pragmatism that lay at the heart of Neil Kinnock as a politician and a person. Yet when he became a Labour MP in 1970, he was not seen as necessarily pragmatic in the way that word was used to describe his successor, Tony Blair. Rather, Kinnock was judged by those in the Parliamentary Labour Party to be firmly on the party's left. The Kinnock of the 1970s was a man of the left who made no bones about stating exactly where he stood. He was, along with Tony Benn and Michael Foot, a key member of the left's part of the No campaign for Britain to leave the then common market during the 1976 referendum. He refused to join Jim Callaghan's government in the 1970s because of Callaghan's refusal to grant Welsh devolution and public expenditure cuts caused by the terms of Britain's loan from the IMF. It is then perhaps ironic that the man responsible for these cuts, then Chancellor Denis Healey, would by the 1980s form a close bond with Kinnock. As a member of Kinnock's shadow cabinet, Healey would be Kinnock's shadow foreign secretary. 2 years before the general election result that would cause Labour to enter its wilderness period, Kinnock was elected to the Labour Party's national executive alongside Dennis Skinner. Whilst his old comrade on the No campaign, Michael Foot, rejoined Callaghan's government as leader of the House of Commons and deputy leader of the Labour Party, Kinnock remained on the backbenches and continued to promote the cause of anti-marketism. Yet it was the 1979 general election that fundamentally changed everything for the Labour Party and would set Benn, Foot and Kinnock on somewhat different trajectories. Following Callaghan's defeat, Foot would become Labour leader in a contest that was bitterly divisive and designed by Callaghan to ensure that his own former Chancellor Denis Healey succeeded him as Labour leader. Healey instead came second to Foot, and so looked ready to assume the deputy leadership of the Labour Party. However, somewhat unsurprisingly, Tony Benn entered to challenge Healey, and an election was fought between the two. The contest was bitter, with many of Benn's supporters going out of their way to verbally assault Healey at meetings. Shirley Williams, commenting decades later, explained what Benn's central aim was if he had become deputy leader of the Labour Party.
Tony deeply believed in the idea of the accountability of government to the party. Now, although I said he wasn't a communist, and he wasn't, that is fundamentally the Marxist belief, that the government is responsible to the party. My fundamental concept was that the government is responsible to the people. So his whole pull was towards putting the Parliamentary Labour Party under the control and authority of the National Executive Committee, which would have meant a party pushed well to the left, because that's where the NEC stood.
As Healey would later quip, he fought harder for the deputy leadership of the party than he ever did for the leadership. As it came to the crunch between whether Healey or Benn would win, Kinnock made a decision that would not only alter Labour's history, but also his own political journey. Kinnock viewed Benn's contribution to the internal debate of the Labour Party as, particularly in the wake of the 1979 election, being ultimately irresponsible and hurting Labour's chances of winning the next election.
The sentiments that mobilised in his favour existed in the Labour Party and had been reinforced and replenished by interests from Trotskyite tendencies and so on. If he hadn't been there with his talent and his background and his resolute course of action to articulate what they wanted and to give it respectability, then it might have provoked some difficulties, it would have had to be dealt with, but it never would have become a source of potential disaster for the Labour Party.
Kinnock had been Foot's campaign manager during the 1980 leadership contest, yet it was he who ensured that Benn wouldn't succeed to the deputy leadership. As this excerpt from a documentary on Denis Healey's life and times as deputy leader of the Labour Party illustrates, Kinnock was pivotal to this decision, though it left him feeling as if he had left the Labour Party in the lurch.
After 6 months of the most bitterly divisive internal election in Labour's history, delegates to the annual conference waited tensely for the result. Among them was Neil Kinnock, who'd organised a number of his fellow left-wing MPs to abstain from voting in protest against the hard-left Benn.
When those results were coming in, I thought, I wish I'd voted for Healey. Why have I inflicted this lack of certainty on myself? Because I knew it was extremely close. It turned out to be closer than anybody could imagine.
From then on, Kinnock was seen in a different light by both the left and the more moderate wing of the Labour Party. There were those on the left who had considered Benn's challenge self-indulgent anyway, but the hardcore Bennites would never forgive Kinnock for what they saw as his pivotal part in ensuring that their leader did not come close to the levers of power in the party. During Foot's leadership, Kinnock served as Shadow Education Secretary and made his name as being a fierce critic of Margaret Thatcher and her government. During the Falklands War, or the Falklands conflict, Kinnock's attack on Thatcher grew in intensity. He stated that it was partly for her presentation of the Falklands War that allowed her to win the 1983 general election.
As I've said on a previous occasion, Mrs. Thatcher's reputation is attributable in whole or in part to her conduct during that Falkland Islands War. And it should come as no surprise to her or to anybody else if, when the question of qualities of leadership are raised, reference is made to the time, the place in which she substantially made what reputation for leadership that she had.
It was during this election that Kinnock's oratory came to the forefront. And at Bridgend, 2 days before the general election, when the result seemed inevitable, he delivered not a fiery speech, but a carefully collected and devastatingly frank one that spelled out what he feared would happen were Margaret Thatcher to be re-elected on the 9th of June, 1983.
If Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday, I warn you that you will be quiet. When the curfew of fear and the gibbet of unemployment makes you obedient, I warn you that you will have defence of a sort, with a risk and at a price that passes all understanding. If Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday, I warn you not to be ordinary. I warn you not to be young. I warn you not to fall ill. And I warn you not to grow old.
The importance of this speech is not simply because of its proximity to the result, and Kinnock's inalienable ability to make forceful and engaging remarks, but because it set Kinnock up as the clear heir to Foot and the person to watch during the inevitable leadership election. Kinnock's utilisation of repetition and emotive language in this speech are, of course, common to most speeches. But in comparison to the more technocratic and policy-themed speech that we looked at in the previous episode, Wilson's White Heat of Technology, both the Bridgend speech and the Anti Militant Speech rely more on emotion than anything else. Kinnock's power is not just in the words, but in his delivery. There is a truly vital passion when he speaks that few other leading politicians possessed during this period or at any other time. This was key to his appeal. He made politics come alive. He turned it from something that could seem dull and artless into a true moral battle. This was key to Kinnock's election as Labour leader in 1983, and his acceptance speech that he gave demonstrates his passion and determination to beat Margaret Thatcher's government. His acceptance speech is a fascinating one and demonstrates the journey Kinnock was entering in his political life at this point. I won't go into too much detail here, however, as I'm sure that I'll be covering this speech in a future episode. Needless to say, there is one part that has echoed throughout political history and is oft quoted. It is this line from Kinnock towards the end of the speech.
And if anyone wants to know the reasons why we must conduct ourselves in this fashion, just remember, all times in all temptations, how you, each and every single one of you sitting in this hall, each and every Labour worker watching this conference, each and every Labour voter, yes, and some other ones as well, remember how you felt on that dreadful morning of June the 10th. Just remember how you felt then and think to yourselves, June the 9th, 1983, never, ever again will we experience that.
This extract sends a clear message, in the same way as Kinnock's kiboshing of Benn's election as deputy leader did, that he would not be held back from leading Labour in the direction he thought it needed to be in, that he would do whatever it took to ensure that a defeat like that suffered by Labour at the 1983 general election would not occur again. This would, of course, put him into direct conflict with Benn, the Bennite faction, and Militant. It is perhaps worth at this juncture, before we go into the speech, to quickly go over who Militant were and how they came to be. Started in 1964, Militant, or the Militant Tendency, as some referred to those who supported the causes of the group, they were not the most powerful of organisations when they started. The group were originally little more than a magazine committee, as Militant was the name of the Revolutionary Socialist League's magazine. Militant, through its first National Secretary, Jimmy Dean, had roots back to the very beginnings of the Labour Party and represented the latest version of the Trotskyite ideology in Labour. It is through Dean and his successor as National Secretary Peter Taaffe that Militant would become wired into certain parts of the left-wing political scene in Liverpool and across the country. Dean's grandfather had been a member of the Social Democratic Federation and an adherent of old Etonian and sometime Marxist H.M. Hyndman. Taft had become involved in militant and Labour politics through the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and together Dean and Taft, alongside Ted Grant, who would be central in Militant's success as an entryist group, were there from the very beginning and through to Militant's success in the 1970s and 80s. Between 1975 and 1980, Militant was successful in not only gaining a foothold in the party, but also avoiding expulsion. In fact, it would not be until a year before the 1983 general election, under Michael Foot's leadership, that Militant would face strong opposition from the party's leadership. The trigger had been Liverpool Labour Party's adoption in 1982 of Militant's policy to set an illegal deficit budget. Coming into conflict with the party would result in Militant members being expelled, but it would not be until Kinnock became leader that Militant would be placed under public pressure and attacked by the leadership as being a hindrance to the party. Kinnock's time to articulate his opposition came in 1985. Militant's association with Liverpool Council had not receded with the passage of time, but, if anything, deepened. Thanks to Deputy Leader of the Council, Derek Hatton, their influence had grown, and by 1985, in an effort to tackle insistences from the government that the council engage in budget cuts, Hatton and the rest of the council prepared to send over 31,000 redundancy notices to council employees. Kinnock knew that now would be a time in which he could attack Militant and keep within the themes of his victory speech made 2 years before. In his victory speech, Kinnock had focused on the Labour Party being representatives of those who voted for it, and subtly implying that it had to focus on the voters and winning them rather than winning internal party squabbles. As Kinnock prepared the speech, Militant were aware that something was in the air. Whilst he had been reticent to take them on before now, the issue over the budget had become so all-encompassing that it would have been impossible for Kinnock not to respond. Militant's editorial team put out a clear message: surrender was not possible. They would not give up the power they had accrued without a fight. The speech Kinnock gave at the conference in Bournemouth in 1985 was a direct rebuke both of Militant and anyone in the party who was more interested in factionalism than Labour being able to win. However, he began the speech by attacking Margaret Thatcher's government. It is perhaps an overlooked fact that Kinnock's Bournemouth speech is as powerful in its rebuke of the Thatcher government as it is the Militant faction. He would, after all, as leader of the opposition, not been able to begin his speech by firmly attacking Militant, as that would have weakened its impact. By beginning with criticising the government and saying how Labour would change things if elected, Kinnock was cleverly preparing an argument that showed how he felt Militant were holding the party back. That by allowing Militant to grab headlines and distract from the failures of the Conservatives, Labour was preventing itself from getting into power and forming a government that could help the people that the Thatcher government were penalising. Kinnock's speech starts with a traditional motif of any opposition leader, listing in stark terms the economic problems caused by the Conservative government. Comrades, this week in which our conference meets is the 333rd week of Margaret Thatcher's government. In this average week in Tory Britain, 6,000 people will lose their jobs, 225 businesses will go bankrupt, 400 million will be spent on paying the bills of unemployed, 6,000 more people will be driven by poverty into supplementary benefit. And in this week, in the world at large, over $10,000 million will be spent on armaments, and less than $1,000 million will be spent on official aid. And in this week, over 300,000 children will die in the Third World. Here, Kinnock combines his naturally emotive rhetoric with clear, hard economic realities. The two intertwine brilliantly to elicit an emotional but also rational response from the audience. How can it be that so many people are driven into poverty, so many people lose their jobs, and yet nothing is done? Kinnock's syntax is fascinating as well. His use of comrades and focus on how much is spent on armaments, in contrast to global aid, is often seen as a hallmark of the left. In his own way, this speech represents Kinnock's attempt to balance a third way between what had existed before, the electorally disastrous 1983 election manifesto, and what would come later. He is, in this opener, marking himself still as a committed socialist in order to make his later criticism of Militant something that couldn't be more ignored, but also as someone who isn't simply expressing left-wing ideas. Kinnock's next few paragraphs were almost stand-up-like in their utilisation of humour against the Conservatives. In contrast to Harold Wilson, whose humour was more academic in nature and more like a witty riposte from Noel Coward, Kinnock had a more Ben Elton flavour. His derivatives were more direct, more stand-up-like. He mocks the then new agricultural minister, John Selwyn Gummer, as being appropriate to the job, as he was used to fertiliser, having previously been Conservative Party chairman. He compares Norman Tebbit to Joseph Goebbels, and suggests that William Whitelaw and Tebbit are like arsenic and old lace. Whilst in abstract the utilisation of this kind of humour may seem off-kilter for a speech that is not only serious, but one designed to attack the Conservatives, in practice it works to an extent. Kinnock's mocking of Tebbit is carefully linked to his next point, in which he addresses Tebbit directly, or almost addresses him directly, asking him to explain the failures of Conservative policy. Ask him to explain, for instance, how the self-acclaimed party of law and order came to preside over a record 40% rise in crime in our country in the last 6 years. How does the declared party of school standards contrive a situation in which Her Majesty's inspectors can describe the schooling system as inadequate, shabby, dilapidated, outdated? And then, on top of that, the government goads the most temperate of professions, the teachers, into taking prolonged sanctions in the schools they work in. How does the party of the family cut child benefit, cut housing benefit, reduce nursery schooling, turn hundreds of women into immigration widows? How does the party of the family hit the old and the sick by cutting funds in the health and social services? How does the party of the family, indeed of the country and of the suburbs, isolate the villages and the suburbs by destroying public transport services? Kinnock's brilliant use of the repetitious, continual, unrelenting questions help drive home the message he is aiming to put forward into people's minds, that the Conservatives, rather than improving the country, have made it worse, that they had hurt both people and services through cuts to public expenditure. One criticism that is often made of Kinnock, as both as a leader and a speaker, is that he tends to be somewhat verbose, that what he could express in a sentence he does in about 2 paragraphs. Whilst this, at times, made him somewhat weak at Prime Minister's questions, when he was doing it during great set-piece speeches, it worked to his advantage. Kinnock had a talent that all good opposition leaders should have, being able to paint a picture using words, an ability to sum up through emotional and factual evidence how the country is suffering because they aren't in power, wouldn't be if they were. Kinnock's speech is of course not simply about attacking Thatcher, but presenting his own vision for Britain. It is somewhat cosseted in comparison to the more outward utterances of Tony Blair, but it is clear from this speech that Kinnock was already moving to posit the Labour Party as one that intellectually understood why people had been attracted to the Thatcher government. Opportunity and a fear that the state had failed, are not wanting to be overburdened by it. Kinnock in this speech posits the state being a facilitator in a similar way that Margaret Thatcher had done, but he frames it as, necessarily, to help the people in a way that Labour voters and Labour supporters could understand and get behind. Whilst it wasn't commented on so much at the time, because of the impact of the later militant comments, here Kinnock is in effect partly accepting the Thatcher consensus. Whilst many argue that it was Blair that accepted Thatcherism, which of course belies Blair's platform, but more of that in future episodes. In terms of changing the language of the party and focusing on watchwords like the state being an enabler, the state being a facilitator, Kinnock is here taking some of the language successfully used by Thatcher for himself. Whether one judges that to be an acceptance of the Thatcherite consensus or merely window dressing, he does, after all, in this clip make clear references to the state being the servant of the people, a phrase equally used by left and right. It is clear that not just because of the attack on Militant, this speech marks a clear and decisive departure from what had gone before. It is Kinnock speaking to the Labour Party, attempting to convince it that it has to change and it has to see itself not as a facilitator of the state being a behemoth over people, but a facilitator of the state being a facilitator for people. Indeed, this is reinforced later on when Kinnock quotes from the Chamber of Commerce and compares manufacturing between Britain and other industrial nations.
How do we pay our way in the world when the oil trade surplus, at present a huge £11.5 thousand million, begins to disappear in the late 1980s? Answers to these questions, said the Chambers of Commerce, from economic ministers and senior civil servants have been unsatisfactory. Comrades, in the last 6 years, alone amongst the major industrial nations, manufacturing production in Britain has actually fallen by 8%. Investment in manufacturing production has fallen by 20%.
Kinnock's continual focus on the economic consequences of conservatism runs through his speech, and can perhaps be viewed as an attempt to change the image of the party, from one viewed to be economically irresponsible to one that, if in government, would invest responsibly. Kinnock focuses not just on jobs but also investment throughout the speech. He is, by 1985, able to channel, to a certain extent, the language of prosperity that, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Margaret Thatcher utilised in both election addresses and during government. Yet Kinnock is clear not to copy her. Rather, he has taken the language and fixes it within the linguistic lexicon of the Labour Party and presents investment and opportunity as not a bad thing, but essential for bringing more jobs and income to the people of Britain. This is demonstrated in this clip.
We're going to use those funds for long-term loans, for the purchase of modern machinery, for research and development, for training. We ensure that the return paid is comparable to what can be got elsewhere, but the difference will be this. Those resources will be here for the process of investment, for the purpose of creating wealth, for the purpose, most of all, of generating jobs here in Britain.
The clip clearly shows how Kinnock is talking about investment, but in a way that sounds acceptable to Labour members. He's talking about investment, but investment that, rather than giving money to city bankers or yuppies or such like, is directed back into the communities that need them. This is clear evidence that Kinnock is aware how to make an argument that has resonances of the third way, not being frightened or reactionary towards investment, but also expressing how investment can be reintroduced in communities that need it. This, of course, is standing very much in contrast to some of Kinnock's earlier beliefs and earlier utterances. It is as Kinnock entered the last leg of his speech that he began the famous and powerful critique of Militant. Beginning by setting out how Labour had to gain trust by not making false promises, Kinnock begins slowly, and his intent is clear. On the line relating to false promises that he's building up to a rebuke of Militant.
We want to honour our undertakings in full, in every sphere, every area of policy. We want to say what we mean and mean what we say. We want to keep our promises. And because we want to do that, it is essential that we don't make false promises. That is why We must not casually make promises that are so fanciful, so self-indulgent, so exaggerated, that they can be completely falsified by the realities in which we live and the realities that we know we shall encounter.
It's a attack on fanciful promises, one that could easily be taken out of context and misconstrued, is clearly aimed at the militant faction. Kinnock is aware that there can be no great revolution against Thatcherism in local government, and that local councils cannot on their own defeat the Conservatives in government. He reinforces this by arguing that Labour's failure to honour its promises and to make ones that aren't reasonable and responsible will prevent the party from entering government.
That precondition is unavoidable, total, insurmountable, and it's a precondition, and in this movement we don't want to surmount. It is the precondition that we win a general election. That is the precondition.
Kinnock is again highlighting that the Labour Party has to make promises it knows it can keep if it wants to win a general election. That to declare that there would be a general strike or a revolution, or that a local council could realistically not implement cuts from central government, because if it did, Labour would continue to be suggesting that it could implement things that could never happen. This would not convince the country that they were a serious contender for government. Kinnock is aware that false or fanciful promises cannot be used by any serious political party. Kinnock's speech reaches its crescendo when he directly refers to Liverpool Council's actions and directly makes the comparison between the impossible promises that will hold Labour back and the council.
Implausible promises don't win victories. I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers.
What is impressive about this section is not only Kinnock's language, which builds up with each sentence and works towards the "a Labour council" climax that has been so oft used on social media in subsequent years, but his ability to paint his opponents as not only out of touch, redundant, but also against the values of the Labour Party. Kinnock's direct linking between the desire to make impossible promises with Liverpool Council sending redundancy notices to its own workers foments the vision in the mind of the viewer that a Labour Party that, rather than trying to realistically help the people it was designed to serve, focuses on ideological imperatives at the expenses of the working class, is a party that cannot win a general election. Kinnock reinforces this with the following part of the paragraph, building on the prior clip.
I'm telling you, no matter how entertaining, how fulfilling the short-term egos, I'll tell you, and you listen. It's all right, it's okay, it's all right. All right. I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services. The voice of the people, not the people here, the voice of the real people with real needs is louder than all the boos that can be assembled. Understand that, please, comrades, in your socialism, in your commitment to those people. Understand it. The people will not, cannot abide posturing. They can't respect the gesture generals or the tendency tacticians.
Again, Kinnock's verbal dexterity is on display here as he weaves a vision of the gesture generals and tendency tacticians holding Labour back, and that whilst they may claim to represent the people that make up the Labour movement, they ultimately don't. Kinnock's message that politics isn't a game is made more explicit in the following clip.
Comrades, it seems to me lately that some of our number become like sort of latter-day public school boys. It seems it matters not whether you won or lost, but how you played the game. We can't take that inspiration from Rudyard Kipling. Those game players get isolated, hammered, blocked off. They might try to blame others, workers, trade unions, some other leadership, the people of the city for not showing sufficient revolutionary consciousness. Always somebody else. And then they claim a rampant victory. Whose victory? Not victory for the people, not victory for them.
The illusion Kinnock here makes between the hard left and the public schoolboys is both a sly dig at Westminster-educated Tony Benn, but also a way for Kinnock to compare the public schoolboys who foment revolution and support militant with the public schoolboys in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. In Kinnock's mind, both have brought harm to Britain, and his argument is that only by removing both can the people of Britain move forward. It is a stylish and substantive piece of rhetoric that fundamentally outlines not just what Kinnock is opposing, but ultimately what he stands for. Not gesture politics, not socialism that is there for show and cares not what the result is, but politics that demonstrably changes the lives of the people that is meant to be. This, in a way, I think goes back to Kinnock's past and his roots. His father once said to him, "Neil, remember that MP doesn't just stand for Member of Parliament, but man of principle." And I think here, Kinnock is displaying that principle and that belief. Kinnock ends his speech by giving a stirring and forthright call to arms for the Labour movement.
We've got to win. Not for our sakes, but really, truly, to deliver the British people from evil. Let's do it.
Ultimately, what is remarkable about this speech is not simply its variety and colourful use of language, a reflection of the man who gave it, but also the extent to which it changed the direction the Labour Party was going in. Not just because of the attacks on the so-called hard left of the party, but the extent to which Kinnock focuses on Labour creating a British state that helps people, but does not hinder. Not some overpowering behemoth, but, as he puts it, a facilitating state. Whether you agree with his assessment or not, whether you believe Labour should have gone in that direction or not, it is hard to argue that this speech doesn't represent the moment in which Labour realised it could not win by failing to recognise Margaret Thatcher had won twice. The initial reaction to the speech was, of course, a mixture of praise and condemnation. Derek Hatton, who was clearly at least one of those Kinnock's speech was directed at, gave a fearsome rebuke to the speech on the next day of the Labour Party conference, the local government day of the conference, looking, pointing and directly addressing Neil Kinnock, who was also on the platform, but was not speaking that day.
We mean what we say, but we do what we mean and we do what we say. And I challenge every trades union leader in this hall. I challenge you, Neil Kinnock, as well, to come to Liverpool, look through the books, and if you can show me any other option where all jobs are safe, then fine, we'll do it. You show me. In conclusion, despite the attacks that have come on, we'll work as hard as anyone for the return of a Labour government. But be warned, in order to do that, we'll be going back to Liverpool and fighting against this Tory government in defence of jobs and services. No retreat for Liverpool, obviously no retreat for Lambeth, and we'll make sure that again Labour MPs and Labour councillors return. Hopefully commies will go out and hopefully movements will come out.
But Kinnock knew that the fact Hatton was so livid showed how effective the speech had been. In the subsequent Kinnock the Movie party political broadcast, one of the most successful party political broadcasts of the 1987 general election, excerpts from the speech, particularly the sections attacking Militant, were heavily used. Of course, this was then parodied by Spitting Image, who were one of the first to utilise the "a Labour Council" line for comedic effect.
Let me tell you what happens. You start with the cello. You move up with the strings. you take it down an octave. You bring it back up again. You swell to a climax. And you end up with the sight of a Labour leader, shouting at the top of his voice to try and be heard above the music put in by the bloody admin.
The speech Kinnock gave in 1985, the one that we have looked at in this podcast, has been cited by many as helping to restore faith in the Labour Party to those who were put off by the party during the Foot years. Though Kinnock never became Prime Minister, without this speech, or his time as leader, it is unlikely Labour would have returned to government in 1997 under Tony Blair, let alone via the biggest landslide in British electoral history. The enduring legacy of this speech is one of restoring a sense of confidence for many people in Labour and defining Kinnock as one of the great speechmakers that Labour has ever produced. I'd like to thank, in help with making this episode, the Tides of History Project, Stephen Richards' series on Prime Ministers that never were, Michael Crick's excellent book on Militant, which was phenomenally helpful. There are lots of other minor sources that I've also used that I'd like to thank as well. Mainly stuff from the British newspaper archives and various extracts that have been posted to YouTube and elsewhere. Thank you for everyone who has provided this kind of content, as it has ensured that this episode of the podcast has happened. In the next episode, I'll be looking at the Tony Blair speech that gave us the mantra, education, education, education. The 1996 Labour Party conference speech. I hope you will join me again then.